Today I've got something a little different for you. I'm ranking my top 50 minor characters from The Big Bang Theory. Now when I say minor characters, I mean anyone outside of the main 7 cast members, and I'm including any characters who appear more than once, so they have to make multiple appearances to be eligible. However, there are 3 exceptions to this rule, and I guess I'll explain when we get to them. This is completely subjective, so let me know your own rankings down below. I am genuinely interested to see who you'd have higher, who you'd have lower, and maybe who I've completely forgotten. I've ranked these characters with 3 factors in mind: how important they are, how memorable they are, and how entertaining they are. I'm also showing what percentage of episodes each character appears in the top right corner. Although I've not directly allowed the screen time to influence me, for the most part we will be starting with the obscure characters and working our way towards the legends. The way this is going to work is I'll go over the first few quite quickly, about 1 line each to summarise them, and then the top 30 I will explain in more depth, especially the top 10. Let's get into it. At number 50 is Joyce Kim. Not hugely important in the grand scheme of things, but the fact that Leonard once dated a North Korean spy is one of the most ridiculous but cool pieces of backstory in the entire show. She's also the first of the 3 exceptions to the multiple appearances rule. In 49th is Lonely Larry. No lines, almost no story, but part of the furniture of Stuart's comic book store. Without characters like Larry, the world feels less real. But still, he's only in 49th place. Next is Dale. A little more memorable, a few more lines, and a fairly decent portrayal of social anxiety in the show. 47 is Captain Sweatpants. 1 nickname, 1 outfit. Technically he has 1 line, but somehow he's unforgettable, so he ranks higher than the other comic book store characters. In 46th is Neil Michael Wolowitz. He's more plot device than character, but he's incredibly important to Howard and Bernadette's development. In 45th we have Cinnamon, the only non-human character on the list. She's much more than Raj's dog. She's basically a symbol of his loneliness and his need for connection. 44 is astronaut Michael Massimino. I find him to be a surprisingly effective foil to Howard during the space storyline. He's funny, and he's a sharp contrast to Howard. In 43rd is Neil deGrasse Tyson. I think for a star guest, he feels quite naturally a part of the world of Caltech, and he's funnier than a lot of celebrity cameos in my opinion. 42, Emily. Not Emily Sweeney, Raj's other Emily girlfriend. She only appears twice, but she's fairly important because she's the first woman Raj can speak to without alcohol. That's a huge moment for his character. She also teaches him a lesson about money, not being able to buy love. I think it's nice when he learns sign language to communicate with her, and as usual he gets emotionally invested, which makes it all the more devastating when she turns out to be a gold digger. 41 is Mrs. Rostenkowski. I always wanted more of Bernadette's family. We hear about them quite a lot, but rarely see them. Her mum is not hugely significant in the show, but she helps explain where Bernadette gets some of her personality from. Also, her interaction with Howard is pretty amusing. In 40th place is Dave Gibbs. He's a genuinely entertaining character who brings a completely different style of humour to the show and plays a crucial role in Sheldon and Amy eventually getting back together. 39 is Kevin Campbell. Not necessarily my favourite type of character. I don't really get on with his type of humour, but as an antagonist in the Nobel storyline, he does his job very effectively. And of course in 38th is his friend Greg Pemberton, an even stronger antagonist in my opinion. He's smug, selfish and memorable, while also being connected to Kripke's storyline. In 37th we have Alex Jensen. I find her to be an interesting character because she creates tension without ever becoming unlikable. She also shows us what Sheldon is like as a boss, which is not always pretty. In 36th I have Hallie Wolowitz. She represents Howard finally becoming the adult he's spent years trying to avoid. And actually I find that she has an impact on the development of other characters as well, including, well of course Bernadette, but also Raj and Stuart. I also like that when she's introduced in season 10, she acts as a kind of tribute to Mrs. Wolowitz, being mostly off screen. 35 is Sheldon's Mima, or Connie Tucker. She's also another one of my exceptions to the multiple appearances rule, because she does only appear once, but I think her importance is felt throughout the Big Bang Theory, long before we even meet her. I'm talking about when Sheldon quotes her and talks about her, but I actually prefer her portrayal in Young Sheldon by far. 34, Ramona Nowitzki. I think she's very memorable for the amount that she appeared, and she was the first character to truly idolise Sheldon. Of course, she also plays a crucial role in Sheldon and Amy's love story. 33 is Nurse Althea. I think that's her name, it's never actually mentioned, but in terms of importance, she might be near the bottom of the list. In terms of humour, she's near the top. Her dry delivery is absolutely perfect, and she does help to flesh out the world of the show. Larry Fowler, Amy's dad, brings comedy, but he also brings a surprising amount of emotion. He tells us a lot about Amy's upbringing and why she becomes the person she is. Next we have another dad, Alfred Hofstadter. We waited years to meet Leonard's father, and he didn't disappoint. His humour is fantastic, and his interactions with Beverly are some of the highlights of that season. I love the little romance he has with Sheldon's mum, and I actually think they make a perfect couple. I only wish he appeared more. Starting the top 30 is Claire, and I actually think she's one of the most underrated characters in the show. In fact, she's probably my favourite of Raj's love interests. A lot of Raj's relationships end up revolving around Raj. They're there to teach him a lesson, move his story forward, or highlight one of his flaws. Claire does that too, but she also feels like she has her own life going on outside of Raj. This could just be me, I don't know. Anyway, she's sarcastic, creative, intelligent, and I think she has a very different energy to the rest of the group. I also like the fact that she was introduced as writing a sci-fi screenplay, because it gave her something distinctive and it ties in nicely with Raj's knowledge of astrophysics. But more importantly, she's one of the first people who really calls Raj out on his behaviour. Raj often sees himself as unlucky in love, but Claire recognizes some of the patterns that keep causing him problems. She challenges him in ways that other girlfriends don't, and for a long time I thought she would end up being Raj's endgame, and I was really disappointed when she wasn't. But she's one of those characters who always leaves me wishing we'd seen more. In 29th is Anu, because if we're talking purely about who I enjoy watching, Claire would probably be above Anu, but Anu ends up being one of the most important relationships Raj ever has. What's interesting about her is that she arrives very late in the series, when Raj is running out of time. Not literally, but I guess narratively, and most of the other characters have found some kind of stability, but Raj is still searching. And throughout the show, Raj spends years chasing relationships, as we know, sometimes desperately, always desperately. Anu forces him to think about what he actually wants, but the reason I rank her so highly isn't really to do with the relationship, it's because of what happens at the end of it. When Raj chooses not to move to London with her, that's one of the biggest moments of growth, I think, in his entire arc. For years, Raj would have sacrificed almost anything to be with someone, and finally he chooses himself. It's a surprisingly mature ending for his character, and I know some fans, including myself, wish that Raj had ended up with someone in a relationship by the end of the show, but more recently I've started to realise I like the fact that his ending is about self-acceptance rather than romance. He's accepted loneliness, he's embraced it, and when you're at peace with being alone and you're comfortable with yourself, you find that you are much more likely to then form a healthy and meaningful relationship. So it does make sense to me. In 28th, Mrs. Fowler is one of the most intimidating sitcom mothers I've ever seen. The first thing she brings to the show is comedy, but she's scary. I find her genuinely scary, but what makes her important is how much she explains Amy. For years we know Amy is socially awkward and emotionally reserved, and she struggles with relationships, but then we meet her mum and suddenly I think it all makes sense. One of the things I appreciate about The Big Bang Theory is that it often uses parents to explain the characters without explicitly saying it, but the difference is that Amy eventually learns how to build meaningful relationships despite her upbringing. Amy's emotional journey becomes even more impressive once we understand where she came from. 27. Mrs. Davis is one of those characters who gets funnier every time I rewatch the show. On paper she shouldn't really be memorable, she's basically the university HR representative, but the role she serves is brilliant because somebody has to, deal with these people. The main cast spend years breaking social rules and workplace rules, ethical rules, and Mrs. Davis is the person whose job it is to deal with the consequences. A lot of her humour comes from her reactions, and she doesn't even need big punchlines like a lot of the characters do. It's all to do with her reaction, the exhausted look in her face. She also helps make Caltech feel like a real institution rather than just the workplace for the main characters. And, the university is an important part of the show, and I think without Mrs. Davis it might feel quite empty. If I were ranking young Sheldon characters, Georgie would be much higher, but this is a Big Bang Theory ranking. But even so, Georgie leaves a huge impression despite only appearing a couple of times. The reason, I think, is because he completely changes our understanding of Sheldon's childhood. For years we hear Sheldon's version of events, and then Georgie arrives and presents an entirely different perspective, and I think it just reminds us that Sheldon isn't always a reliable narrator. And in the scene where we first meet Georgie, he forces Sheldon to confront something he rarely thinks about, which is the sacrifices other people make for him. which is a pivotal piece of information in Sheldon's huge leap in development. If you remember in the final episode when he acknowledges that his accomplishments belong to his friends as much to himself. The emotional conversation they have about their mother when their father died is one of the strongest scenes in the entire series, in my opinion. But just as a character, Georgie has this swagger about him which I absolutely love, and a lot of people do. Missy ranks slightly above Georgie because she appears more often and because she's one of the few people completely immune to Sheldon. Most characters either accommodate him or become frustrated by him, but Missy doesn't really do either of these. Obviously she spends her entire life dealing with him, so she knows exactly how to handle him. I also love her brief friendship that she forms with Penny. In a strange way, they're actually very similar characters. And in 24th place we have Stephanie Barnett. Stephanie is one of the most overlooked girlfriends in the show's history, in my opinion. I think part of the reason is that she arrived before the show really settled into its long-term relationships. If she had appeared a few seasons later, I think people would remember her much more fondly. But what I like about Stephanie is that she's genuinely kind. She gets along surprisingly well with Sheldon, she's patient, she's intelligent without being arrogant, and she seems to genuinely care about Leonard. And that's quite rare in the early seasons because Leonard's relationships often revolve around tension or incompatibility, but Stephanie actually works, which is why it's significant that Leonard ends the relationship, and for the first time in the series, Leonard actively chooses what he wants rather than simply clinging to the relationship in front of him. So it's a subtle but important step in his development, and that's all thanks to Stephanie. In 23rd, I have Stephen Hawking. I think he's the greatest celebrity guest star in the entire series. A lot of celebrity appearances in sitcoms rely entirely on recognition. The joke is just basically, look who it is. But Stephen Hawking is a bit different. I think he becomes a genuinely funny character, and what makes his appearance work so well is his relationship with Sheldon and the others. I think for the first time in the series, Sheldon becomes the nervous one. He's the fanboy. He's insecure. I think it's fascinating watching someone who usually thinks he's the smartest person in the room suddenly become desperate for approval, and I just find his teasing of Sheldon absolutely perfect. He never feels mean, he never feels self-important, he just feels like someone enjoying himself, and I think the real Stephen Hawking, may he rest in peace, also got a lot of enjoyment out of appearing on the show. Next is Mike, Bernadette's dad. I think he's one of those characters who says very little but kind of steals the scenes anyway. A lot of the humour comes from the fact that he always just looks disappointed by everyone around him, particularly Howard, at least initially anyway. But underneath the humour there is actually something quite emotional happening. Howard spends a lot of the series searching for father figures because his own father abandoned him, and he desperately wants approval or some kind of relationship with a father figure, and over time Mike gradually fills that role, reluctantly. You know, it's not a dramatic relationship, it's very subtle, but I think that's why it feels more realistic. And very briefly in season 7 he also becomes something of a father figure for Sheldon too, which I find interesting. I'm cheating slightly by discussing these two together, but to be honest they're at their best as a pair. Despite spending much of the show communicating through screens, they managed to create an incredibly vivid picture of Raj's family life. We can see where his dependence comes from and his romantic idealism, and where, some of his insecurities come from, and they also provide some of the show's funniest family interactions. The arguments, the passive-aggressive comments, cultural expectations are interesting, the pressure around marriage and success, and all of that makes Raj feel like a more complete character. But if I had to separate them, I'd probably put Mr. Koothrappali slightly higher because he appears a little more and gets a bit more development, slightly more. But really, they're the show's greatest double act. Every sitcom workplace needs someone whose job it is to deal with the chaos, and for The Big Bang Theory, at least in the early years, it's Dr. Gable Hauser. By the way, he's not the president of the university, some people confuse this. As far as I'm aware, he's the head of the physics department. He's certainly not the most memorable character on the list, but I think he's more important than people give him credit for. Without him, Caltech would feel less like a real university, and he represents actual accountability. He's one of the few people who can actually tell Sheldon no as well. I think that's quite important because the early Big Bang Theory Sheldon is almost impossible to manage for anyone. A lot of the humour comes from watching him slowly realise exactly what kind of people he's dealing with. He starts off trying to be professional, but over time he develops the same exhausted frustration that most viewers would probably have. I also like that he's motivated by money and public image rather than pure science, because it creates a nice contrast with Sheldon and the others. He's not flashy, but he's an important piece of the show's world building. This will be one of the most controversial placements on the list. After all, He only physically appears once, making him my third and final exception to the rule. Even then, it's only through an old tape recording. So why is he this high on the list? Basically because his importance isn't measured by screen time. There are very few characters in The Big Bang Theory whose presence can be felt in episodes they never appear in. George Cooper is one of them. For 12 seasons we learn about him through Sheldon. We hear about stories and lessons and arguments, mistakes, memories, and what fascinates me is that George is one of the few characters who becomes more important because he's absent. His absence shapes Sheldon. When a parent dies so young, they often stop being a person and become a collection of memories, and that's exactly what happens here. The scene in season 12 episode 10 where Sheldon discovers his father's old coaching tapes is one of my favourite moments in the entire series, maybe my favourite. It's also one of 2 times that I actually cried watching the show. The advice wasn't even intended for Sheldon, but somehow it becomes exactly what he needed to hear, and even though Sheldon never really associated himself with his dad in that way, he realises that their lives were more parallel than he realised. And when Sheldon says thanks dad, it absolutely destroys me every time. It's one of the few moments where Sheldon allows himself to be vulnerable, and it's proof that George's influence never really left him. Lucy's one of the most divisive characters in the entire show, so I expect some resistance here. A lot of fans find her frustrating, some find her difficult to watch even, and I do as well, but I also find her interesting, and therefore she's memorable, which helps her rank quite highly. What separates Lucy from most of Raj's girlfriends is that her awkwardness isn't played entirely for laughs. I mean, it's uncomfortable, sometimes painfully uncomfortable to watch, and I think that's very intentional. Raj and Lucy are similar in some ways, but they're also very different. Raj desperately wants connection, and Lucy desperately wants to avoid situations that might require connection. Watching those two personalities collide creates a relationship that's awkward, messy, and difficult to sustain. But another reason she ranks this high is because without Lucy, Raj doesn't become the character he eventually becomes. Their breakup leads directly to one of the biggest breakthroughs in the entire story, which is him being able to talk to women without alcohol, and for years that was Raj's defining limitation. Lucy indirectly helps him overcome it, and I think that's a significant contribution for a relatively short-lived character. Another controversial one, I think. In 16th place we have Kurt. I know some people are going to think I've completely lost my mind putting him this high, but just hear me out a minute. Imagine the first season without Kurt. I mean, seriously, I think Leonard and Penny's early dynamic would feel completely different. I think Kurt serves as an important narrative function. He's everything Leonard thinks he isn't. He's confident, physically imposing, traditionally masculine, the kind of guy Leonard assumes Penny should be with, and the kind of guy many viewers at the time assumed Penny should be with. In a lesser sitcom, Kurt would simply be a bully. Instead, he's more interesting than that. I find him interesting anyway. I mean, yes, he's selfish and intimidating, but he's also a symbol of Leonard's insecurity. The real conflict isn't Leonard versus Kurt, it's Leonard versus Leonard. Without Kurt, a huge amount of the emotional foundation of Leonard and Penny's relationship, which is the most important storyline in the show, simply doesn't exist. At least early on, I think we should have seen a lot more of him. I don't particularly enjoy Priya episodes. In fact, there are times when I actually dread them during rewatches, sometimes I even skip them. But that's exactly why she ranks this highly, because Priya is incredibly effective. She enters the story at precisely the moment Leonard and Penny seem to be moving toward each other, then she completely disrupts everything, which I think is why I find her annoying. What makes Priya interesting is that she's not really competing against Penny, she's competing against the audience. The audience already wants Leonard and Penny together, so Priya starts at a disadvantage. But despite that, she's intelligent, successful, confident, and completely reasonable in a lot of ways. The problem is that she's standing in the way of the relationship everybody wants. But what people forget is that she's also probably the most significant catalyst behind the formation of the Amy, Bernadette, Penny friendship group. Those 3 characters bond partly because they all find themselves united against Priya in one way or another. So while Priya isn't particularly likable, she ends up being hugely important. Sometimes good characters aren't the ones you love. Sometimes they're the ones who create the most interesting conflict. Oh, also she can hold her own against Sheldon, which is fun to watch and impressive. Emily is probably the closest Raj ever gets to having a long-term, fully developed relationship. She dates him for nearly 3 seasons, which is a huge amount of time compared to most of Raj's girlfriends. And what I appreciate about Emily is that she never loses her own identity. A lot of sitcom partners eventually become extensions of the main character. Emily never does. She's strange and dark, and confident, and she's completely comfortable being those things. I love the fact that she's almost the opposite of Raj in certain ways as well. Raj often wants people to like him, Emily doesn't seem particularly concerned whether they do or not, and I think it's her confidence that makes her memorable. Their relationship is also important because Raj eventually chooses to end it himself, and that's a huge deal. For years, Raj chased relationships and clung to them whenever he found one, and breaking up with Emily shows real growth, and it's one of the first signs that he's starting to think about what he actually wants. After he breaks up with her, he starts standing up for himself more in general. 13 is President Siebert. His energy is fantastic, and what makes him so funny is that he simultaneously values and despises the main characters. He knows they're brilliant, he knows they bring prestige and funding to the university, but he also knows they're a nightmare. Particularly Sheldon. In many ways, he acts as the voice of common sense. He's often looking at situations and reacting exactly how a normal person would react. The difference is that he's trapped in a world full of geniuses who constantly create problems for him. I can almost imagine a spin-off about him, or I can imagine a rewriting of the show from his perspective. By the later seasons, especially during the Nobel storyline, he becomes surprisingly important. 12 goes to Wyatt. Penny's dad is one of the most believable characters in the entire series. Yeah, let's go with believable. He feels like somebody you could actually meet. And I think that's why he sticks in my mind so much. A lot of sitcom fathers fall into one of two categories. They're either overprotective and aggressive, or they're completely incompetent. Wyatt is neither. His relationship with Leonard is one of my favourite things about him. He likes Leonard, and that creates a completely different dynamic, which I'm not really used to seeing in sitcoms. Instead of being an obstacle, Wyatt becomes one of Leonard's biggest supporters. And more importantly, he gives us a clearer understanding of Penny. And Penny is a character who is vastly under-explained. Whenever Wyatt appears, we learn something about her family, her upbringing, her insecurities, and her ambitions. He's one of those characters who improves every episode he's in. I would love to see him in a spin-off, although I'm not sure how that would make any sense. Just missing out on the top 10 is Bert, one of the most underrated characters in the entire show. The other characters don't take him particularly seriously, but that's exactly why he works. Bert represents a different kind of outsider. They're all outsiders, aren't they, in their own way, but they've found each other, and Bert hasn't. For a long time, he's standing on the edge of the group looking in, trying to belong, trying to connect, and that's surprisingly relatable. I think a lot of viewers see themselves in Bert. Almost everyone knows what it feels like to be on the outside of a group they want to join, and what makes Bert lovable is that he never becomes bitter about it. He's earnest, he's sincere, and he keeps trying. That's why I'm also excited about the upcoming spin-off, because Bert feels like a character with a lot more story left to tell, and I'm hoping he gets more of the spotlight. He's never one of the most important people in The Big Bang Theory, but he's one of the most human. Kicking off the top 10 list is Denise. Denise could have been incredibly easy to get wrong. She could have been written as female Stuart, and for a while I thought she was. She could have been written as the nerdy girlfriend, she could have existed purely to give Stuart a happy ending. Instead, she feels like a fully formed character in her own right. What I like about Denise is her intelligence. Most characters are intelligent in obvious ways. Scientifically, academically, professionally, and then some characters are emotionally intelligent. But Denise is both. She's emotionally intelligent and analytically intelligent at the same time. Also, she genuinely likes Stuart, and because of that he gradually starts seeing himself differently. And Denise doesn't magically fix him, but she helps him believe he might actually deserve happiness. And I also think Denise helps to redeem some of the show's treatment of its more socially awkward characters. The message becomes less awkward people are funny, and more awkward people deserve love too. And that's why she makes my top 10. Will Wheaton is one of the cleverest recurring characters the writers ever created. When we're first introduced to Will, he's basically a villain, or at least a villain in Sheldon's world. The joke is that Sheldon has carried a grudge against him for decades after a no-show at some comic book convention. It's petty, and the funny thing is Will matches that pettiness. Again and again, he manages to manipulate situations with the sole purpose of annoying Sheldon. In fact, as a character, he loves to stir the pot in general, not only with Sheldon, but he comes between Leonard and Penny as well on at least 2 occasions that I can think of. But eventually he becomes a friend. By the later seasons, Will is one of the people Sheldon actually trusts the most. He's someone Sheldon goes to for advice, and because we've watched years of conflict beforehand, that friendship means something. 8th place goes to Barry Kripke. Kripke is a terrible person. Let's get that out the way. He's arrogant, selfish, manipulative, his attitude towards women is awful. As a person he's terrible, but as a character he's fascinating. The main group often like to imagine science as a noble pursuit of knowledge. Barry sees it as a means to an end, money. He sees it as competition. What makes him so entertaining is that he's never intimidated by Sheldon. He's also a representation of a very different kind of theoretical physicist to Sheldon. Over time, he becomes Sheldon's most consistent rival. But what I love is that the rivalry eventually evolves. He hangs out with Sheldon outside of work a few times, and by the final season, Barry actually helps Sheldon. After years of conflict and years of insult, Barry chooses to do the right thing. Granted, more out of hatred than love, but still. And without that information about Pemberton's thesis, Sheldon and Amy might never have won the Nobel Prize, and that's such a satisfying conclusion. I just find him to be a complex character, and I think that complexity is going to be explored in depth in the new spin-off. I surprised myself with the next one. 7th goes to Arthur Jeffries, Professor Proton. What a character. Arthur is funny, awkward, cynical, surprisingly self-aware, and somehow he's also one of the saddest characters in the show. When we first meet Arthur, he's basically living in the shadow of his own past. Once upon a time he inspired children, and then the world moved on. His career faded away, his marriage fell apart, and he's left wondering whether any of it mattered. There's something surprisingly realistic about that. Many people imagine success as a permanent destination, and Arthur shows us that it's not. Success can disappear, fame can disappear, purpose can vanish, and that's what makes him such an interesting character. He's also one of the few mentors Sheldon ever has. The episodes following Arthur's death are some of the most emotionally intelligent moments Sheldon goes through. And the fact that Arthur keeps appearing as a projection of Sheldon's subconscious tells us something very interesting. That deep down, Sheldon understands far more about grief, regret, and human emotion than he lets on. Arthur's humour alone is enough to get him on the top 10, but it's the emotional depth that gets him all the way to number 7. Number 6, Leslie Winkle. Leslie is one of the biggest missed opportunities in the entire series. And I know that's a bold statement considering how successful the show became, but every time I rewatch the early seasons, I find myself wishing we'd gotten more of Leslie. What makes her so memorable is that she's one of the only people who can genuinely challenge Sheldon intellectually. I mean, sure, Penny can challenge him socially or emotionally, but intellectually he has very few rivals. In the early seasons, before Amy arrives, Leslie is arguably the closest thing Sheldon has to an equal. Sometimes she even comes across as smarter because she's not blinded by her own ego. She's also one of the few characters completely unimpressed by him. Most people either admire Sheldon, tolerate Sheldon, or become frustrated by Sheldon. Leslie simply dismisses him, and that drives him absolutely crazy. I also think she was ahead of her time for the show. Long before Amy and Bernadette become major characters, Leslie was already proving that female scientists could be funny, intelligent, and distinctive without being reduced to stereotypes. She has her own voice, her own humour, and her own ambitions. It's a shame she gradually disappears after season 2 because I think she could have become one of the most important characters in the entire series. Okay, we're in the top 5 now, and this is where it could get personal. Some people might disagree, but let's just get into it. In 5th place, we have Zach. Zach is one of my favourite sitcom characters. Not just Big Bang Theory characters, sitcom characters. Because Zach could have been such a cliche. In almost every other sitcom, Penny's rich, attractive ex-boyfriend would be written as a caricature. He'd be the obstacle standing between Leonard and Penny. The audience would be expected to dislike him. Instead, Zach is probably one of the nicest and most likable people in the entire show. And more importantly, he has absolutely no idea he's supposed to be Leonard's rival. That's what makes him so funny. The conflict exists entirely in Leonard's head. But there's something deeper going on too. Zach challenges one of the assumptions running through the show. The assumption that intelligence equals worth, and also the assumption that nerds are always the good guys. The main characters often look down on Zach because he's not academically gifted, and there's an episode where they even bully him. And yet Zach is frequently happier than they are, he's kinder than they are, and sometimes more emotionally mature as well. He's one of the few characters who consistently sees the good in people, and because of that he becomes much more than a joke, and he makes me smile whenever I watch the scenes that he's in. There are plenty of funny mothers in sitcom history, and there are plenty of memorable ones, but Mary feels like somebody who exists even when the cameras aren't rolling. She's tougher than her young Sheldon counterpart, she's sharper, more intimidating, and funnier. A lot of the humour comes from the contrast between Mary's religious worldview and the highly scientific world Sheldon inhabits. Mary matters because she's one of the few people capable of grounding Sheldon emotionally, and the others for that matter. She understands people better than almost anyone. There's also something really touching about her relationship with some of the other characters, particularly with Leonard. In many ways, Mary becomes the mother Leonard wishes he had, and it's one of the reasons Mary's appearances always feel significant. A character we never see, unless you count this, has made my top 3 characters. And I stand by it, because somehow, despite never properly appearing on screen, Mrs. Wallowitz becomes one of the most memorable characters in television history, let alone The Big Bang. See, the thing is, I'm an incredibly visual person. Normally, if I don't have a visual aid, I struggle to remember things as well. But Mrs. Wallowitz is permanently lodged in my memory, partly because of the voice, partly because of the hilarious shouting matches, but I think what elevates Debbie above being a running joke is the humanity underneath. Howard's relationship with his mum explains so much about who he is. The dependence, the insecurity, this apparent fear of growing up. All roads lead back to Mrs. Wallowitz. And what's remarkable is how much she affects other characters too. I mean, look at Stuart. When Stuart is struggling, she takes him in. When he has nowhere else to go, she gives him a place to belong. And then, of course, there's her death, which is one of the most emotional moments in the entire series, because suddenly this voice we've heard for years is gone, and we realise how important she'd become. That's the sign of a great character. You don't fully appreciate them until they're gone. And the runner-up is Beverly Hofstadter. You all knew Beverly was going to be near the top, because Beverly is just so much more than a sitcom character, especially when you remove the laugh track. Suddenly she's not just funny, she's uncomfortable and complicated. She's just fascinating. What makes Beverly such a great character is that she explores something surprisingly deep, which is the lasting impact parents have on their children. Leonard spends almost the entire series trying to earn Beverly's approval, and everyone else's approval because of that. Not because she's cruel, but because she's emotionally unavailable. That's what makes the relationship so compelling. The thing is, Beverly does love Leonard. The problem is that she expresses love through research, observation, and achievement rather than affection. She studies Leonard, she even writes books about him, but she doesn't nurture him, and because of that, almost every insecurity Leonard has can be traced back to her. His need for validation, his fear of rejection, his tendency to compare himself to others, and his desperate desire to be enough. Beverly is at the centre of all of that. What's brilliant is that despite this, the show never presents her as a monster. She's still a human, just a flawed human, intelligent but emotionally stunted. The scene where Leonard finally forgives her is extremely moving. Some people think it's the most important scene in the entire show. Beverly is one of the deepest characters the show ever created. And finally, number 1, first place goes to Stuart Bloom. Of course it does. Now I know what some people are thinking. Stuart isn't really a minor character. And I understand the argument, but let's look at the stats. He appears in around 30% of the series, and admittedly that's a lot more than most characters on this list, but compared to the main cast, he's still clearly outside the core group. What you have to remember is that he was meant to be a minor character, but he claws himself towards honorary main character energy, and he even gets his own spin-off. And that just goes to show what an amazing minor character he is. Stuart represents, well, many things, but for one thing, loneliness. Stuart is isolated, depressed, insecure, and convinced that nobody really wants him around. He's often the butt of the joke, the person invited last or not invited at all, and that's exactly why he's so relatable. A lot of people are Stuart, or feel like they're Stuart, trying to find where they fit. Although the decline is persistent, what makes his story such a brilliant one is that it doesn't stay there. Over time, he slowly becomes part of the family. Not the main family, and not one of the central group, but family nonetheless. Our family. The comic book store becomes a home for all. Anyway, that's why he ranks as number 1. If you haven't seen the deep dive I made on him, that will explain it in a lot more detail. Anyway, that's my ranking. Let me know yours in the comments. Maybe your top 3 characters or something like that. I would love to know. I'm sure there are some placements you'll completely disagree with, and it's fine. We're allowed to disagree. That's half the fun. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.